Okay, folks, given the senator's busy day and he needs to get to something else shortly, let's kick things off. So again, a hearty welcome. My name is Carl Danz. I'm an OpenAir volunteer, been with the group about 2 years, and I love the OpenAir model, and in particular, the fact that many of our members not only advocate for policy, but actually write policy, and it's pretty exciting to be part of this organization. So we're here today to talk about what's going on in California specifically with regard to carbon removal, and very specifically a bill introduced by Senator Becker, SB 308. So we're super excited to have him here with us today. So OpenAir is a volunteer-led group, volunteer led, and the energy that comes from citizen advocates coming in. I feel it every day. It's a great organization. We've been working on policy development at the federal level, at the state level, and even jurisdictions bring in multiple counties and that sort of thing. And it's a combination of citizen lobbying. We have an advocacy wing, if you will, and citizen science. There are makers and people actually creating new ways of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it's a great organization, and you can see in the chat the link to join if you're so inclined. So again, without further ado, I want to kick it over to Senator Becker. Following that, we'll have a presentation and a panel discussion, which will come shortly. But again, over to you, Senator Becker. Thank you.
Great. Well, wonderful to be here with all of you. And just want to say a few opening words. This is such an important topic, and it's really just dawning on people, as Carl and I were just mentioning. I was in Glasgow, and there was like a small side meeting, and I felt like it was like Star Wars, a rebel underground, of people working carbon removal. But people are going to look back 5-10 years from now and look back at this group and look back at the work we're doing and saying, wow, that was really important. I'm glad people were thinking about this. And they'll be even more grateful and happy if we are successful in what we're trying to do here and what we're trying to do with my bill this year, working along with the side of the community. There's a lot of education, as you mentioned. People still get very confused between carbon capture and carbon removal. Carbon capture is considered part of the 85% direct emissions reduction. According to CARB, we need 15% carbon removal. That's 65 million or 70 million metric tons a year of carbon removal by 2045 to get to net zero. Oh, obviously, we have to get much more than that to really stave off the worst effects of climate change. So it's incredibly important that we help. And the best thing we do is create demand. Just like we do the renewable portfolio standard, we required utilities to purchase renewables, and that created demand. And we started exceeding our renewable portfolio standard every year. And similarly, there's lots of great technologies, many of which are represented here already from the folks that I've seen on this call. We need to create that demand so that we can build that long-term predictable market for carbon removal. So we launched this new industry. So that's really what I'm trying to do here with this bill. I'm excited to work with all of you. Many of whom I've already met. If not, please feel free to reach out. Ken Branson on my team as well. Ken may be on this call. He's really leading this effort, but he's also, I think, actually going out with the rest of our legislative team because he's here in Sacramento. So he may not be on this call, but many of you know him already. So the bill is SB 308. Excited to work with you all on it going forward. I think we'll be fine in the first committee, but from then on, it's going to be, rocky. Well, Ken is here, but from then on, it's going to be, might be some rocky sailing. So look forward to working with all of you. And with that, apologize, got to run, but we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much, Senator Becker. Appreciate it.
All right.
Take care. Wow, that was great. Okay. Well, let's just dive in, and again, check the chat. You'll see Ken has dropped his email address for your reference. And let's just get right into the presentation. A little bit about what's coming up next, and I'm going to kick it over to my colleague Ava.
Thanks so much, Carl. And hey, everyone, thanks so much for joining us on this Wednesday. I'm so excited to talk to you a little bit more about carbon removal and why California is a unique leader in this space. Just quickly on me, I'm based in Oakland, California. I've grown up here my whole life. I've done some research on carbon removal, and I've also been a grassroots climate organizer with Sunrise Movement for years. So I see so much synergy between community action and climate action. And so without further ado, I'm going to kind of just go over through some of the basics of carbon removal as well as some of the climate science that drives it. I'm sure that many of you on this call signed up because you're familiar with carbon removal. But before we dive into the specifics of the legislation, SB 308, that we heard a little bit from Senator Becker about, as well as our incredible panel, just kind of, go through some of the basics. So carbon dioxide removal, it means activities that remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs, or in products like concrete. In other words, it's both the removal and the sequestration that are kind of critical pieces of this process. And as far as terminology goes, there's a bunch of different terms that are flying around. We generally use CDR, which means carbon dioxide removal, but some similar ones are GGR, which is greenhouse gas removal, essentially just inclusive of non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gases, or negative emissions technology. The core differentiator for all of these terms, as opposed to some of the others, both that Senator Becker mentioned, but that you also might have heard in the broader carbon market, is that carbon dioxide removal actually lowers atmospheric concentrations. And thus it actually lowers warming. So you'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute, but that is kind of the litmus test that we use. Which kind of brings me to why, funny enough, it might be easier to talk about what carbon dioxide removal is not before we jump into the specifics of what it is. The first thing to note is it's truly not a substitute for really, really mission critical emissions reductions, sometimes called decarbonization work. Anything from renewable energy to energy intensity gains to other types of reductions or decarbonization, including deep decarbonization, are super, super critical. And carbon removal is simply something we do in parallel to keep us, to stave off the worst consequences of the climate crisis. Similarly, it's not a substitute for adaptation, which as our world warms, we're facing more and more consequences. Removal is not going to fix that. And, part of it is just keeping temperatures as low as possible, so less adaptation is necessary. Another thing that carbon dioxide removal is not is point source capture. We want to be really clear in distinguishing between carbon capture, which prevents CO2 from entering the atmosphere, meaning it prevents additional warming, from carbon removal that actually reverses that process. It pulls the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Again, that litmus test of lowering concentrations and lowering warming. And finally, carbon dioxide removal is separate from carbon offsets. Carbon offsets are another way to avoid emissions. And again, that's preventing additional warming. So you could pay for a carbon offset credit. That means you're paying for someone else not to emit. The net impact being the emissions that you're still producing. For carbon removal, it's kind of the opposite. CO2 emissions will be emitted, and then you could pay for a removal credit that creates a net impact of zero. Okay, so what exactly is it? There's a whole spectrum of approaches. It's really a suite of approaches that share that common denominator of removal and sequestration. And I'm so excited to hear from the panel in a moment about the different ways that they're pursuing different removal options. But the spectrum is broad. There's natural sinks like trees, soils, peat, or mangroves, things that naturally sequester carbon that we could reforest or grow more of, or increase their ability to store carbon, organic carbon. There's durable biostorage. This is known as like biomass. So different types of approaches that include this would be things like biochar, bio-oil, BECCS, and those durably store carbon dioxide in biomass. Mineralization takes atmospheric air and it kind of reacts with different chemicals or minerals, almost essentially turning it into stone. What that does is it stores it very permanently. And then there's many ways to capture carbon dioxide that's in the oceans. And then a common way for carbon dioxide removal to to happen is with direct air capture. And we'll hear from company leaders who are pursuing all these different types. So those are kind of the core concepts, a little background on why we need carbon removal now. What is the science really saying? A lot of you on this call know this. These are just kind of global basics on climate change, but warming is increasing, and with that comes greater consequences. Part of that is because CO2 is a long-lasting pollutant. So on the left, we're seeing how as concentrations increase, so do temperatures. On the right, we see how climate impacts are being seen and felt today, and unfortunately, they're getting worse. This is a really critical concept when we think about removals because every fraction of a degree matters. So if we're passing targets, and you'll hear us talking about keeping global temperatures to 1.5 or to 2 even, and these are magnitudes of difference. So when we think about how removal can reduce global temperatures, there is real value in staving off a 1.8 degree world and keeping it at 1.6 or 1.5, or better yet, 1.3. That these fractions of degrees, they have huge implications. It reduces suffering. Ecosystems have more time to adapt. In general, it buys us a little bit of time to advance more equitable solutions. And the reality is, with the tools that we have been deploying for the last couple decades or decades and decades, is that we're not on track. There's this huge gap between what it will take for us to get to a 1.5 compatible world by the end of this century and where we are today. Global emissions haven't peaked. Try as we might to decarbonize as quickly as possible, and we need to continue and increase momentum there. We need to look at all the tools in our toolbox. That's why every climate model has some amount of carbon removal. This is a graph we'll come back to a lot, and you've probably seen if you're in this space. This is the latest IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Their latest report predicts or theorizes how much carbon dioxide removal we really need, and how that's going to interact with our other levers of reduction. So in the gray and the orange, you'll see the emissions reductions greatly need to decrease by mid-century and beyond. At the same time, we need to ramp up these green sections of removals. The goal, just to kind of hammer this one more time, is to get to net zero, ideally by 2050. What that does is stave off the worst consequences by the end of the century. And the feat to do that can't be understated. We talked a little bit about the spectrum of CDR solutions, but just to say it again, it's not just, sometimes you'll hear a distinction between natural CDR and technological CDR, which isn't quite the right binary. Sometimes there's a lot of methods that are kind of in between. It's more of like a spectrum. But even the IPCC kind of echoes this sentiment. There's ways to increase the organic carbon and carbon sinks with trees and soils and other more natural methods. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we're going to need other types of engineered solutions. Oh, wow. That was such a fun animation. Okay, so this is another way of looking at kind of all the different types of CDR approaches that we've talked about. Some of those relating to the more natural side, while others are kind of fitting under the more engineered side. But the kind of key thing to remember here is there really is no one silver bullet. You'll see in the news and you'll see companies grow that, take brand new methods for removing and storing carbon. And it's a good thing to kind of figure out at this early stage of where we're at, exactly which ones work, which one faces different types of roadblocks to scaling. Yeah. Cool. So here's just a quote from the IPCC based on that graph that we looked at, but it echoes the need for carbon dioxide removal to limit 1.5 degrees, or to limit warming to 1.5. And importantly, they say all pathways that do that with limited or no overshoot project the use of CDR on the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons over the 21st century. And I guess I have to pause and explain that a gigaton is 1 billion tons. It is so much carbon dioxide that needs to be removed to keep these temperatures low. We emit between 30 and 40 gigatons every year. So by mid-century, we're looking at least 10 gigatons in addition to severe and swift decarbonization efforts. This is just another quote. IPCC hasn't changed their tune over the last 5 years. I mean, this was in the latest AR6, which is kind of the latest report that they put out, but similarly denoting that kind of how essential CDR is. And so part of why the IPCC and other climate scientists, explain why CDR is so necessary at the scale that we're talking about is for a couple reasons. Emissions reductions will continue to happen, and we need to increase that momentum. At the same time, there's a number of industries that will be really, really difficult to fully remove emissions from. These are called like difficult to abate emissions. So things like aviation, some parts of like heavy industry processes, a lot of agriculture at the scale that we'll need in mid-century. These will require a lot of fossil fuels as well. That's regardless of, electrifying transport and changing all of our buildings. So it'll be pretty tricky to get some of these industries fully carbon free. The other core rationale for carbon dioxide removal, we talked about how CO2 emissions will stay in the atmosphere a really long time. This is called legacy emissions. Part of what has been so convincing to me, coming from like the climate justice community a little bit, is knowing that, look, if we snap our fingers and decarbonize everything tomorrow, we're in a temperature threshold of about 1.1 degrees Celsius. And that is fully unacceptable for communities across the globe. And so I see the carbon removal industry as a way to really like alleviate some of this lineage, some of the social marginalization that has impacted communities, my neighbors, even here in the Bay Area. There's disproportionate risks that a lot of climate communities face if you're in a more developed or a more developing country, or you have a different socioeconomic status. You're facing greater risks for other interconnected issues. And further, there's a lot of exclusion of voices in leadership and development. So part of what I'm so excited about this is the ability for the removal industry to kind of flip the narrative a little bit and change who's driving this. How are we benefiting communities at large? And in some words from an Indigenous activist I follow, how are we decolonizing the atmosphere? Part of this is cleaning up the mess that we've created. I love this quote from the Indian Minister of Power and Energy. It really kind of gives you a global view on the necessity of carbon removal on that nation, or not nationwide, globally. So in order to give others more space to develop, it is important for all developed nations to talk about not net zero, but how to remove more carbon that they're adding. So let alone getting to net zero by mid-century, there's folks that are calling for developed countries to actually get into the negative territory. That allows for the time and emissions for other countries to get to a place that we've been able to get to in the United States, for example, by emitting so much. There's kind of this like moral imperative to do that, while if we were to emit so much and develop our countries to the degree that we have, and then turn around and tell India and other countries that they can't emit because we're in dangerous thresholds, they know that and they need to. So we need to think of other solutions. Cool. I wanted to share this video. This is Maria Reyes. She is a Fridays for Future activist based in Mexico, and she's sharing a little bit on her take on carbon removals as a means of climate reparations. Let me know if you can't hear it.
Basically, one of the most famous climate reparations forms, it's money. Always. It's the easiest thing to give money away. And I think it's very needed, and especially during this COP, we're discussing a lot about climate finance and how the climate finance should be arriving to the communities most affected. But I believe it's not enough, and it's actually a short-term solution that doesn't fully address how those who have been most responsible for the climate crisis need to take responsibility for following their money and see what it's actually doing on ground. And so, basically, I believe that carbon removal can be a way of climate reparations that goes one step further and actually addresses and tries to reverse.
Great. She goes on to talk a little bit more about that perspective, but I love it. I love the energy. I think the perspective is so spot on. And what I want to do is kind of shift this narrative a little bit away from like, it's not really about, what tech companies doing, what process and how much we can down cost and commercial. Like, that's all important. But at the end of the day, like the goalpost of what we're aiming for is getting to a world that is livable for everyone, for not just future generations, but the right now, the folks that are feeling the impacts today. That's partly why I'm so motivated to see this industry grow. So yes, the next decade, that's even generous. The next 7 years is critical for carbon removal. Back to this graph, we're trying to close that gap by kind of whatever means necessary. We need to halve greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050. So what we're seeing right now is this massive scale up of decarbonization, funding, opportunities, new pathways. That's incredible. That momentum needs to continue. There's companies and individuals and communities thinking about overhauling almost every sector of the economy, and that's an ambitious and important task. What's kind of a false binary is thinking that we can wait until mid-century to do the same for carbon removal, given the fact that we need to start scaling up and figuring out what works today. We need to start a little bit sooner. And that's echoed by a lot of climate scientists who have really, really looked at the numbers. So they say, unless affordable and environmentally and socially acceptable CDR becomes feasible and available at scale well before 2050, pathways to 1.5 will become difficult to realize. So we can't afford to wait. And scale takes time. Across pretty much every industry, it's not something we can kind of flip the switch and be removing gigaton scales of carbon removal overnight. Greg Nemeth is a really incredible academic who wrote a book called How Solar Got Cheap. And this is a little bit blurry maybe for you. I don't know why it is for me, but partly what he mapped out is how the pathway from getting solar in 1957 discovered and by accident to 2017, which is cheaper than most other energy sources. That was 60 to 70 years meandering through new policy regimes, technological breakthroughs, different countries taking the reins on leadership. That was tricky and kind of roundabout and way too slow for what we need to do with, for example, direct air capture, but that would be kind of emblematic of the carbon removal industry overall. But what we're talking about is a suite of approaches that's far more complicated than just solar PV up and running in essentially less than 20 years. Which again brings us to today and how we can catalyze the development and deployment of carbon removal. So if we know we're pressed for time, and we know the scale is massive, like how are we best setting ourselves up for success today? I like to think about the industry kind of as pillars from this like systems view. You can basically take any which one and start tackling it. You can think about R&D and how you can ensure that we're leaving no stones unturned with the research and development side of things. You can think about it from standards and methods. So we're ensuring that we're incorporating the latest scientific evidence, keeping our carbon accounting up to snuff. Of course, we need cost reductions and a bunch of commercialization to really meet the scale required by mid-century. And we need public acceptance. We need everyone on board. We need to ensure that we're scaling in a way that's centering justice and equity and keeping accountability top of mind, including transparency. If not, we risk creating tons of friction down the road with the very same people that will be on the front lines of the scale up. So instead of meandering around like the solar industry did, like how do we get strong and bold leadership? That's the question at hand today. We've been thinking a lot about leadership levers for the removal industry. Part of it is like there's the natural and physical resources needed to reach the different approaches in scale. There's a bunch of institutional architecture to enable standard setting, commercialization, input from communities, and so forth. And of course, there's policy support, climate policy in particular. And California is truly uniquely positioned for this. They have it all. They have abundance of natural resources. They have high quality research labs. Budding carbon removal companies are making California their headquarters, and a really robust environmental justice community and network to provide input and standards. They also have a bunch of policy that's kind of related. So essentially, we're about to turn to SB 308 in a moment here. But I do want to say that there's so many other climate policies that will feed into this and be supported by this policy. So it's really kind of rounding out our ecosystem here. This is a slide that we could get a little bit more into the weeds on later, but it's mainly just talking about how California really needs CDR. Our reduction goals are to get to net zero by 2045, which is 5 years before the IPCC's 2050 benchmark. And the way they're imagining doing that is 85% reductions, which is the bulk, and then 15% removals. And 15% is small, but it's no small task. It's about 75 million metric tons. So when you really start to dig into it, you can see that we're a little bit behind. The last note, and something I just wanted to share on why California can be and should be the leader here for the removal industry, is the ability to counteract other states, and that the values that a policy like this would push forward and signal to the rest of the country and the world is that, you know, carbon removal industry is something that can alleviate some of the issues that we've been seeing. Because the soul of the removal industry is being fought over right now, we're seeing some states use carbon removal as kind of a front for fossil fuel interests to prolong their lifetimes or their profits. We see CCS or EOR and other types of adjacent technologies essentially continue the status quo. And that's like not what we want to do. And California can be the leaders that are pushing forward strong standards, strong removals, so we prevent a race to the bottom situation. Awesome. All right. So turning quickly to SB 308, just to give everyone a little bit of a background, we have a really fun action zap at the end of this. We'll try to save a few minutes at the end of the hour. But before we turn to the panel, I just wanted to walk through what the key components of this policy was. I know we heard a bit from Senator Becker, but the core objectives are to catalyze project development through direct demand support, foster growth and the diversification of the sector as a whole, and establish selection criteria to essentially eliminate climate risks and maximize benefits to communities. These projects will hopefully be all over the state. So the core of this bill is to establish a state negative emissions purchasing program. What that means is that we would essentially require folks to pay for the emissions that they're producing. This is critical for our state goals to get to net zero, and it creates early demand and catalyzes the sector, specifically in California. So there's a few ways that other key components that kind of prop up that end goal of creating the purchasing program. Part of it is ensuring there's high quality in all of the removals. The bill would authorize the California Air and Resources Board, CARB, to measure and select for high quality and actually disqualify ones that don't hit it. It would also, another key component is to prioritize co-benefits and avoid harms. So this could, attract private investment, stimulate economic activity, could even do stuff like reduce wildfires depending on specific inputs and so forth. So there's a lot to be discussed with how exactly and what co-benefits to prioritize. And the last pillar of this bill is actually figuring out who exactly is paying for this. It's not taxpayers. It would be those most responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. In this way, based on this purchasing program framework, emitters themselves are required to buy the negative emissions equal to a percentage of their emissions. It starts small and it grows over time. But this is super in line with a kind of justice view of accountability around climate impacts, and one that truly internalizes the impact of CO2 pollution. Woo, ran through that so quick. I know that was a lot of information. Hopefully that was all tracking for folks, or if you have any other questions, feel free to DM me. We wanted to save a bunch of time to hear from our incredible panel. So I'm going to turn it back over to Carl to introduce them, and then we'll get on with it. Thanks so much.
Wow. Nice work, Ava. That's a compelling call to action if I've ever heard it. And yeah, perfect setup to have the amazing panelists representing 3 different California companies. Super excited to have each of you with us. So Becker Meyer is head of climate policy at Heirloom, Ben Tarbell, co-founder and CEO at Ebb Carbon, and Mary Yap, co-founder and CEO at Lithos, who especially appreciate you joining us all the way from Switzerland, I think you said. Wow, well done. So to kind of kick things off, as you introduce yourselves, if you could just share a bit about your company, the underlying technology, and the specific carbon removal approach that you're focused on, and maybe Vikram, we'll start with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us, and to OpenAir Collective, thanks for convening this today. And Ava, that was an incredible overview. Heirloom is a direct air capture company that is on a mission to remove about 1 billion tons of CO2 by 2035. We know that's ambitious, but we know that the math demands urgency, and we're really excited to do so in a way that is quite natural in its overall process. Oftentimes, when we think about carbon removal and we think about direct air capture as a pathway, we think of a very technology-intensive process with a lot of systems, a lot of engineering. But Heirloom taps into a very earth-abundant resource, limestone. If you've ever climbed a mountain, the chalk that you end up using on your hands has limestone in it. The concrete in the building you're likely in right now has limestone in it. And so by taking limestone, our technology is actually able to supercharge it by removing one CO2 molecule out of that limestone rock. And that turns it into this unstable form that naturally wants to pull in massive amounts of CO2 from the environment around it. So in effect, we've been able to build out a very natural direct air capture process by using these rocks, stacking these rocks up high on trays, and being able to pull out a natural stream of carbon dioxide. And we're really excited to be able to have announced just a month and a half ago that this technology is working. Our R&D facility in South San Francisco, right near the SFO airport, if you all are familiar with the region, was able to pull CO2 out of Bay Area air and mineralize it and store it in concrete, and then pour that concrete back into infrastructure projects back in the city of San Jose. So really an interesting loop of being able to clean the air, restore that CO2 into concrete, and pour that concrete back into the infrastructure in the built environment. So that's a little bit about Heirloom, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit further about why things like legislation around SB 308 are so important to grow and facilitate that process even more.
Awesome. Thank you, Vikram. And at OpenAir, we love concrete. So that was we celebrated that win with you when we heard about that success. So thank you so much. Well, Ben, maybe you could kick us off with a similar kind of corporate overview and what's your specific focus, and that'd be great.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks to OpenAir for this convening. Super important topic, and we're excited to be here. So ebb carbon starts with what is the natural process to restore the atmosphere. If we waited hundreds of thousands of years, the extra CO2 in the air would create acidity in the rain, which then washes alkaline minerals into the ocean. And once that alkalinity is in the ocean, it converts CO2 to a natural form of carbon called bicarbonate. And so we're doing exactly that, but we're just using electrochemistry to accelerate that same process, so that it happens in weeks to months instead of hundreds of thousands of years. And so, we've developed a proprietary electrochemical system that does that. It processes salt water from the ocean. We put our systems at existing industrial plants that have saltwater flow. So imagine a desalination plant or an industrial plant that uses ocean water for cooling. We take that water before it returns to the ocean, process it through our system, produce the alkalinity, and then as we add that alkalinity to the ocean, it has the same reaction that would happen naturally. It just happens faster. And this approach has some distinct advantages. So, all of CDR, is dependent on two important principles: additionality and permanence. And so, with our approach, we can achieve a high degree of permanence, 10,000 plus years of stable natural storage. And this is an elegant solution because the process by which we're capturing the CO2 is also the process by which we're storing it. So we don't have a separate process where we need to find a way to store the CO2. It's highly scalable. We heard earlier about the lessons learned from solar. That's where I meandered for many years. But we've seen, because of the modularity of that approach, we've seen the costs come down very quickly. And so this approach and others in the CDR space are modular in a way where we see a pathway to significantly reduce costs. And because of the vastness of the ocean, we can achieve gigatons of scale. And then, it's efficient. So, again, because we're using these natural processes, we rely on those processes to perform most of the work. And therefore, we're able to use very little energy. We can also ramp our system up and down very quickly. And so the energy we use can accommodate intermittent renewable forms of energy. And then lastly, it's fundamentally restorative. So one of the key additional benefits to what we're doing is, in addition to removing CO2 from the air and sequestering it, the net result of what we do is essentially a reversal of the ocean acidification that happens because of climate change. And so we have those two fundamental restorative benefits.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ben. That's a great overview. Very compelling. I love the idea of modularity and reusing existing facilities like desalination plants. I think that's going to be one of the keys to success, right? Is to figure out how do you plug things into existing infrastructure. Fantastic. And Mary, over to you, all the way from Switzerland. Thank you for joining us.
Well, normally I'm normally on the West Coast, but so excited to join you guys here today, and thanks everyone for tuning in and learning more about the bill. So really excited to be here. A little bit about our technology. We are in some ways kind of similar and connected to Heirloom and Ebb Carbon over here. So we do a special process called enhanced rock weathering, which most of you guys probably haven't heard about before. So I'll share a little bit about how that works. Essentially, what we do at Lithos is we transform farmland into permanent carbon capture centers, or permanent carbon removal centers to be more accurate, using the power of volcanic rocks. We use a special kind of volcanic rock. It's a dark black rock called basalt. There's plenty of it in California, so we're very lucky from that perspective. And the power of this volcanic rock is such that it actually can trap carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it for 10,000 years or longer. So it's permanent carbon capture. A very cool thing here is we are actually using waste byproducts. We are not mining, we're not crushing, we're not grinding this rock. It is actually something that sits in the millions of tons in California and all across the world and in America, in the millions of tons, because it's a waste byproduct and nobody needs to sell it or use it today. So we are actually upcycling that stuff, bringing it to farmers where it actually does two things. One, it removes carbon out of the air and it's very powerful, very scalable. But two, the thing that actually I'm personally very excited about is it actually can help improve crop yields. So in our real farms today, we've improved crop yields up to 47%. We are not robots yet, despite the craziness that is overtaking California right now. We need to feed a growing population for the world, and we need to do that faster and more effectively, ideally without having to expand the land use for agriculture, right? Well, the exciting thing here is that actually when we add this special volcanic rock dust to the soil, it actually enriches the soil. It rebuilds topsoil, hopefully helps, save off that dust bowl stuff that we saw about 100 years ago. We don't want to repeat of that. And the basalt actually improves the quality of the soil. It helps with moisture and nutrient retention, and thus helps the crops grow better. So we're really excited here to hopefully be able to kill two birds with one stone, remove carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, store it permanently, and also be enhancing crop yields and soil health across America. So I guess the other thing that really matters to us from an EJ perspective is the fact that we're boosting the bottom lines for farmers, not only because their crops are growing better, but we are actually replacing another existing expensive product that they use today, which is limestone, the stuff that Vikram just taught us a lot about. Farmers use limestone today to capture carbon, and actually we are able to replace the cost of that for them with this volcanic basalt that actually improves their crop yields beyond the limestone. And beyond that, farmers have a hard time making ends meet. We also give them access to a high quality, durable carbon market. So we give them carbon credits as well. So something that's really important to us from a mission-based perspective is that this is scalable worldwide. My family are smallholder farmers in Taiwan. They still grow fruits and vegetables in the highlands. And actually the fact that we can help things for smallholder farmers without having to compete for land use, we can actually scale this today. We don't need to do a massive change practice. We don't need to, have new land or anything like that. It's really powerful. So I'm very inspired by the range of different kinds of solutions that we have today. I think we need absolutely all of them to sort of make carbon removal work at the massive scales we need to tackle. And at Lithos, we're very excited to do this by upcycling some waste dust, maybe opening up some limestone markets so that more limestone can go over to Heirloom and we can swap that out in California for more basalt. And also tied into Ebb Carbon, we also create bicarbonate. So when we're trapping the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, we're creating bicarbonate ions, and technically that will eventually go into the rivers, the lakes, and the open ocean, where it helps deacidify the oceans, helps like mussels and other freshwater creatures and things that are in the surface ocean grow better shells and help the ocean from that perspective. A little bit less efficient than Ebb Carbon on that, but also just incredibly important to think about the ecosystems and figure out how we can plug these solutions into nature. So very excited to be here with y'all today.
Wow. Thank you, Mary. And thank you to all three of you. I'm feeling more personally hopeful and optimistic than I was, 15 minutes ago, and I was already pretty hopeful and optimistic. So this is fantastic. So for the audience, you'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That's where we'd love to have you put your questions. We're already getting a number of great ones. I've got one more question for the panelists, and then after that, we're going to turn it over to the audience Q&A. So again, if you could put your questions into the Q&A and not in the chat, that just makes it easier for us to sort through it. So all three panelists have done a fantastic job of sort of explaining what they're doing and how it's getting the job done. We're here today also to talk about policy, and a number of you mentioned that. I think we know from what Senator Becker said at the top of the webinar that he's got a great bill here in California. So that's one piece of it, but it'd be great to hear from each of you. What specific policy changes do you think could have the biggest impact to help your business scale up, as quickly as possible? Maybe we'll go kind of in reverse order. Mary, why don't you kick us off on that one, if you would, please? Thanks.
For sure. Great question, guys. I think that's something that's incredibly important here is establishing a carbon market and also making sure that there's high quality. One of the things we think about most at Lithos, and I know Vikram and Ben probably share the exact same perspective, is we need a high quality market. We need transparency. We need accountability. If we are doing carbon removal, that's great, but we need to do carbon removal for a while. We can't just do it for 2 years and be like, okay, guys, we've solved the climate crisis. That is not going to happen. It would be like scooping a cup of water out of the ocean. We need to make an enduring market here. And so one of the things we think about is how do we sort of fight the worries, the erosion of trust and credibility that we have seen in carbon markets so far. There are so many articles, it almost feels like one hits me in the face every single week, coming out about, oh my gosh, carbon offsets are junk, or this is not working, that is not working. And so I think it's really important for California to be a leader here, require quality exactly as CARB is doing, and say that this is the standard for a good carbon removal ton, so that that 1 ton of removal actually equates to 1 real ton of removal. So I'm going to pause there, but that's actually one of the biggest things for us: quality, making sure that is guaranteed, and also making sure that we're doing right by the communities that we're operating in. So safety, quality of materials, how are we engaging stakeholders, all of that. But I'm sure we'll get into that more in the panel.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for that, Mary. And Ben, how about you? What policies would help ebb carbon go up and to the right very quickly?
Yeah. So I mean, I'll add to Mary's list, but I'll start by saying that so California has a strong and well-earned reputation for being ahead of the curve on new technologies. And if we're to solve climate change, if we're to deliver the 10 gigatons a year we need, that the IPCC says we need, this is essentially $1 trillion industry. And California knows a thing or two about spawning new industries of this scale. And so, CDR deployed responsibly represents the best of California, and it's an opportunity for us to show leadership, but also create an economy. And so, for us, in addition to what Mary said, I think first and foremost, we need to get the incentives right. And so Senator Becker's bill goes a long way in that direction. We're very supportive of it. We have to find a way to help California meet its net neutrality goal by 2045. And the way to do that is to pull in a broad range of CDR solutions that can all scale. And so we need the incentives right, and we need the incentives to drive the right technologies to scale. And then second, we need to update the permitting paradigm. Today we can deploy safely within the existing permits, but these permit systems were not designed with CDR technologies in mind. They do not have the pace or anticipated scale that we will need in order to achieve these goals. And so, to get the most effective technologies deployed responsibly, we need policy on permitting to catch up with the science and essentially create a regime where we can move quickly on these important problems.
I'll just add to that from an Heirloom perspective. I think Ben and Mary nailed it when it comes to market incentives and enabling the market. Right now, for Heirloom, as an example, we're really lucky that a lot of different technology companies, as an example, your Microsofts, your Stripes, are purchasing carbon removals from Heirloom, but those are all voluntary purchases. These are things companies want to do for their GHG commissions. We think we can diversify that customer base through bills like SB 308 by creating a new class of customers where polluters are mandated by the government to purchase carbon removals. That's great. But also we think that if the government were to potentially get in the business of procurement, we saw that the state of Massachusetts just held a hearing yesterday on legislation where them as a state government could potentially be a buyer. We know that the state of New Jersey already passed legislation of the state government being a purchaser of clean concrete, basically CO2 stored in concrete. So if we have voluntary buyers plus compliance-based buyers like SB 308 would enact, as well as other types of purchasing power from the government, then we get a lot of demand side of activity that incentivizes more and more venture capitalists and project financiers to invest for us to make the supply of these carbon removal facilities to meet these ambitious amounts of demand. So I just want to underscore what they put there, what both of them mentioned. I'll also just add very quickly to Ben's point on permitting. Alongside permitting, at least for Heirloom, is that we really want to make sure that the amount of CO2 we're pulling out is much, much greater than the amount that goes in. And so the state I'm currently in, California, is really good at encouraging renewables, but we need renewable energy deployment across the country, making it easier for grids to be able to take in green electrons, making it easier for solar and wind farms to come online. And I underscore this because while we might be preaching to the choir from a citizen lobbying perspective of who's on this call, right now, the state of Texas, as an example, has legislation that would block the building of more solar development and more renewable development. That might be a one-off. That might be just what Texas does because Texas does certain things in odd ways at times. But I think we all have a collective mandate to make sure that we're pushing our lawmakers and our representatives to encourage more incentives on the renewable side too, so we can all work in tandem to make sure that power is green and the removals are strong.
Wow, beautifully put, all three of you. Clear calls to action from each of you. And speaking of calls to action, just as a reminder to the audience, just at the very end, we'll have a specific call to action for each of you regarding Senator Becker's bill SB 308. So be sure to stay tuned for that. So with that, I would like to turn our attention to some of the audience questions. And some of you have seen that our wonderful Chris Neidl has been busily answering some of the questions in the background. But there's others that I would love to have the panelists weigh in on. And actually, I think one of the questions to kick us off, it's sort of an aspirational question from Kevin that says, can we dream about removing all post-industrial revolution CO2? And I love that question. It sort of evokes this notion of restoring the climate, and a few of you have spoken about that. Ben, you used that word. I remember that. So yeah, anybody want to weigh in on that idea?
I think it's the right ideal. I mean, certainly we've seen some of the companies who are active in this space, Microsoft as an example, who have made that as their commitment. So it's not net zero, but it's essentially, claiming responsibility for all of the emissions they as a company have emitted over the life of the company. And I think that's the right ideal. I think that's certainly what we as an industry should be pushing for.
Other thoughts from others?
Yes, I absolutely agree with the sentiment. I love the idea. It's a really, really lovely notion. I think it's definitely something we should aim for. We should dream big, and also kind of like the image behind Carl in there, the Earthrise, taken from the surface of the moon. We have to think big here. Like, this is actually a moonshot. Nobody in human, kind has ever removed even 1 million tons of carbon dioxide permanently from the atmosphere before, right? So we are all trying to do something that humans have not done before, but we really do think that through this collective action, this collective wisdom, we actually can do this in a responsible way. One of the things that we think about a lot here at Lithos is actually the global potential for carbon removal through enhanced weathering. For what it's worth, we have seen actually ice ages come out of silicate weathering before. About 40 million years ago, when the Himalayas uplifted, there was so much basalt rock exposed now to the special process that removes CO2 from the air that we actually went into an ice age. I think that is wholly unlikely. We are probably not going to do that. We would stop far before we ever got there. But, the nature has a very, very strong, powerful restorative power here. And I think it would be great to think about not just how do we do this in California, and not how do we just do this in America, but how do we actually scale very responsibly these carbon removal methods across the globe and bring in sort of stakeholders and opinions and, stakeholders globally. So I think it's absolutely something we can dream about. And I think that if we think about all the different regions that we can pull into this new economy, I think it actually could be possible. It's a moonshot for sure, but hopefully possible.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mary. And I love that you evoked the moonshot, and some folks will know that the Department of Energy has what they call their carbon negative shot, which is a direct tie into that concept of the moonshot. So beautifully done. All right. Well, let's see. A lot of great questions coming in, and apologies in advance. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. But maybe focusing on California, the specifics here. We've mentioned the basalt, but one of the questioners is asking, is California a viable location for permanent sequestration due to seismology risk? I've heard that question from others in the past. Anybody want to take a crack at that?
I'm going to offer some thoughts. So seismology risk may be a challenge for subsurface CO2 storage, but there are many ways and many types of geology that you can store CO2 underground in, and one of those ways is to mineralize it. So, if it turns into rock, it's pretty stable. Obviously, not all approaches require storing CO2 underground. So ocean alkalinity does not. The carbon is stored in the form of bicarbonate ions in the ocean. And so seismology is not a factor there. But there's certainly a wide range of ways of storing carbon in California, not all of which require an awareness of the risk of seismic activity.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And with apologies to the audience again, so many great questions came in. We didn't have a chance to get to all of them, but in the interest of time, we're going to move on to our call to action. I will say that we've got all the questions recorded, and so we'll do our best to follow up after the webinar to answer your great questions. And once again, my sincere thanks to all three panelists for joining us and presenting such a compelling case for the idea of being hopeful and optimistic about solving this huge problem. So thanks again. All right, over to you, Chris.
Thanks again, Carl, so much, and Ava for excellent moderation. And we just scratched the surface with these three amazing companies that represent very different forms of carbon removal that can take place in California. And they would be the first to let you know that they're not alone. This is a really, really fast growing industry. And the beating heart of it is in California. More startups in California for this than anywhere else in the world. So now our goal is through this excellent bill that Senator Becker has put forward to try to actually really push play on that potential and support it. So we need your help. OpenAir is entirely an advocacy organization. For those of you who didn't have your questions answered, join OpenAir. We talk about these things in very specific terms all the time. I put the join link in there as well as my own personal email if you're interested in becoming a SB 308 activist. And we're not going to pass this without you. So I wanted to just point in 2 minutes to two key things you can do right now. This is a critical time. The bill was just introduced in full text last month. We have our first major hearing with the Environmental Quality Committee in the Senate on the 19th of April. So we need to let members of the Senate right now, where the bill has been introduced, to know the constituents care about this bill and want them to co-sponsor it. So there's three key mobilization tactics or activities that you can get engaged in. One is if you're with I'll start over here on the right. If you're with a organization or a company that is supportive of SB 308 or think you might be, I did put a link into a new memo of support that we're going to be continuously adding organizations that support the bill. And every few weeks, we'll circulate that to every member in the legislature. So reach out to me if you are an organization that is interested in, needs to know more, or is already ready to add yourself to the memo of support. So the link to that is there. As we go forward, one of our key methods that we use is we get groups of constituents together to present on the bill, either in person or on Zoom directly to their legislators. It's highly effective. We do it all the time. So we need your help to play a role in that. If you're interested in potentially joining a citizen lobbying session for 20 minutes or 30 minutes with your legislature in the coming weeks and months, let us know. Again, join OpenAir. Carl is a 10-year veteran of citizen lobbying, and we have many other people with relevant skills that can help you get plugged in for your district. The one I want to call attention to, which is most timely and immediate, is to call your state legislators. Right now, we have a Senate bill, as I mentioned, so we're only calling senators. Soon we'll be calling assembly members as well. So we made it easy for you to call your legislator. There's a tool that I linked the URL to in the chat, and I'll leave the chat open for a few minutes after we end here so that you can copy it. And this makes it very, very easy for you. Here with the yellow, if you don't know who your state senator is, type in your zip code, press look up, and it'll tell you who that person is. And then in block 2, it does a lot of things. It tells you the offices that you can call. You can try the Capitol office. If you don't have luck there, you can try the district office, but you can try the Capitol office now because the legislature is in session. We're also, if you click on the script, use your own message to the maximum extent you possible, but this gives you at least the scaffolding to look at some talking points and main things that the bill does that you can use when you make that call. These are usually a minute, 2 minutes long. They're not very long, so hopefully that's enough. When you're on the call with the office, you can say, well, who should I send more information about the bill to and what's their name? And you could add their name and their email along with your name and email and hit send, and it automatically sends them an email with you copied directly to that person that gives them the bill, a bill brief, and a frequently asked questions document. So definitely do that. And then last, let us know what happened. If no one answered, leave a voicemail. Those are really, really valuable. But if not, let us know if you were asked to call back, or if you talked to a receptionist, or if you managed to talk to somebody who's on the legislative staff, if that's obvious to you. Click that box and hit report. And the reason why that's important is we want to know how many calls are coming in. So if you look at that tool on the bottom, there's a map that every call that gets made is going to show where it was made. And that's important for us to know who's getting called and who's not getting called. So please do go ahead and take 5 minutes to look this over, make a phone call. But if you're somebody who also has a network of friends or other associates who you think might make a call, share the link with them, give them some guidance. The more calls, the better. And particularly in this next week, before we get into that hearing, we need to have a high volume of calls going in. So with that, I think that wraps it up. Carl and Ava, I don't know if you had any final words, but really appreciate everybody joining, and really please do join us. This does not happen without a lot of Californians getting involved and letting their legislators know that they should support SB 308.
Yeah, just a final thank you. Thank you, Chris, for introducing that call tool, and to everyone who joined us on the panel, Vikram and Ben and Mary. I really appreciate all the insights. I just wanted to make it feel easy to do the call tool. I just joined OpenAir this year, like the last couple of months, and it's invigorating and a little terrifying to make the calls, but I promise you can do it. I've done it. And so I just want to, big +1, and encourage you to get involved with politics that will impact you and your community. So thank you.
Well put, well put. All right. Well, add my final thanks. It's been great having all the attendees, and especially all 3 panelists, Mary and Ben and Vikram. Thank you again. And with that, go call your senator. All right. Thanks, everyone.